You're moving out immediately? What prompted this sudden shift? I could barely believe what I was hearing. The living room, usually warm and cozy, felt cold and unfamiliar. Ben, my stepson, stood by the front door with a duffel bag at his feet. His fiancée, Kara, a pretty girl with bright eyes and dark hair, stood a few steps behind him, her arms crossed protectively over her chest. "It's not personal, Loretta," Ben said, shifting uncomfortably. "Kara's family has expectations." I glanced at Kara, who quickly looked away. "Expectations? Ben, after everything we've built together, you want to leave?" Ben's face softened for a moment, but then he hardened his resolve. "They want us to live closer to them. They think it's important for us to build a new life together, away from here." I could hear my husband Keith's footsteps coming down the stairs. "What's going on here?" he asked, eyeing the scene with suspicion. "Ben's moving out," I said, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. Keith's brow furrowed. "Moving out? Why?" Kara stepped forward. "My family is traditional. They believe it's better for a newly engaged couple to start anew, somewhere away from past ties." "Doesn't this feel a bit rushed?" I pressed, looking directly at Ben. "We had no warning." Ben sighed. "I'm sorry it's sudden, but it's what Kara's family wants, and I want to make her happy." My heart ached, but I tried to keep my voice steady. "Don't I play a part in this family anymore?" Keith intervened, his voice calm but stern. "Ben, we understand you want to keep Kara's family happy, but we should have been a part of this decision." "It's already done, Dad," Ben said, his tone final. "We're leaving tonight." A tense silence filled the room. Kara looked at Ben, then at Keith, and finally at me. "We have to go. There's a lot to prepare." I walked closer to Ben, my hands shaky. "I hope you understand how much this hurts us. Ben, we've loved you like our own." Ben's shoulders slumped a bit. "Loretta, it's not about love or family. It's about what's best for the future." Keith's voice grew more firm. "Your future or theirs?" "Our future," Ben insisted. "And that's the end of it." Kara tugged at Ben's sleeve, nodding towards the door. He picked up his bag, gave a final nod to his father, and without another word, walked out the door with Kara close behind. The door closed with a soft click, but the echo of their departure felt like a cannon shot in my chest. I looked at Keith, searching for some kind of solace in his eyes. He reached out and squeezed my hand, but there was little comfort there. We stood in the living room, the silence pressing down on us. Finally, Keith spoke, his voice weary. "We'll get through this, Loretta. We always do." I nodded, but the sentiment fell flat. With every step Ben took away from us, it felt like a piece of our family was unraveling. My mind swirled with questions and pain, but no answers came. Only the cold realization that things would never be the same lingered, like an unwanted guest in our home. Dinner was supposed to be a welcoming family tradition. Tonight, though, it was thick with tension. The dining room, freshly painted and refurbished, seemed stark and sterile under the harsh overhead lights. I sat across from Keith, with Ben and Kara to my right. The clatter of silverware was the only thing breaking the uncomfortable silence. Keith cleared his throat and spoke up first, trying to cut through the awkwardness. "So, Kara, when will your family be arriving?" Kara looked up from her plate, her face tight. "They'll be here next week," she said flatly, then shoved a forkful of mashed potatoes into her mouth. I put my fork down, struggling to keep my voice even. "Kara, do your parents really think it's better for Ben to leave his family behind?" Kara hesitated, avoiding my eyes. "My family's old-fashioned. You know that." Ben jumped in, trying to smooth things over. "It's not about leaving you behind, Loretta. It's about starting something new." "Something new," I echoed, bitterness creeping into my tone. "And what about everything we've shared up to now? Is it all just forgotten?" Kara shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable. "It's not about forgetting. They just have certain expectations." I glanced sharply at Keith, hoping for his support. Instead, he balled up his napkin and changed the subject. "How's work going for you, Ben?" Ben seized the escape. "Busy, preparing for the wedding and all." I couldn't hold back anymore. "So, our family is just an inconvenience to them?" My voice trembled with the surge of emotion I could no longer contain. "Is that what this is about?" Kara's fork clattered to her plate. "It's not personal, Loretta. My parents just have strong beliefs." Keith sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Maybe we should all just take a step back and cool off." Ben's face tightened in frustration. "We're not trying to hurt you." but we need to do what's best for us. And apparently that means cutting ties with us, I shot back, feeling the sting of betrayal sharper than ever. Kara pushed her chair back, standing up. This isn't doing any good. We're just going in circles. Ben followed her lead, standing as well. We'll talk later. Let's just leave it for now. I watched them leave the dining room, their figures retreating into the hallway and then up the stairs. Only the ticking of the old clock on the mantel filled the silence. Keith rubbed his temples, looking worn out. Loretta, we can't force them to stay. They have their own lives to live. Do they, Keith? Or are they just running away from us, from all the memories we've created? My voice broke again, and I hated how vulnerable it sounded. Keith sighed again, heavier this time. Let's just give them some space. Maybe that's what they need. I nodded, though it felt hollow. The room, the house, everything seemed emptier without Ben's presence. And Kara's influence was like a dark shadow over our once bright home. As we sat in silence, the remnants of dinner growing cold before us, I couldn't help but feel like this was just the beginning. Something deeper, something more disturbing, was pulling Ben away from us. And I had a sinking feeling that whatever it was, it wouldn't leave any of us unscathed. The attic was dimly lit, dust motes dancing in the slivers of light, filtering in through the small window. It was cluttered with boxes of old clothes, holiday decorations, and childhood keepsakes. I had come up here to distract myself, to find some semblance in the chaos Kara and her family had brought into our lives. I opened the first box, revealing a jumble of toys. An old fire truck, some action figures, Ben's treasures from when he was little. I picked up a battered teddy bear, its fur worn and loved. I ran my fingers over it, remembering the many nights Ben had clutched it tight. Loretta, are you up there? Keith called from below. Yeah, I'm here, I replied, my voice echoing slightly in the confined space. He climbed the ladder, his head poking up through the hatch. What are you doing? Just clearing out some old stuff, I said, not looking at him. He climbed the rest of the way up and sat down next to me. You don't have to go through this alone. I sighed heavily. It doesn't feel like anyone's on my side, Keith. Ben left so abruptly, and Kara's family, it's like they've taken him from us. Keith leaned back against a box, looking tired. Maybe they think it's what's best for him. Do they even care about us? About what this means to our family? Keith rubbed his temples. It's complicated, Loretta. They have different values. I tossed the teddy bear back in the box, the frustration boiling over. Different values, huh? Seems like they just want to erase us from Ben's life. Keith didn't respond, just looked down at his hands. I grabbed another box, rifling through it. Old school papers, drawings, report cards. Every piece was a memory, a piece of Ben's life that we had cherished. They want me out, don't they? I said quietly, almost to myself. Keith shifted uncomfortably. It's not about you, Loretta. It's about Ben's future. I found a photo album at the bottom of the box. Opening it, I flipped through pictures of birthday parties, vacations, Christmas mornings. Funny, don't seem to see Kara's family in any of these, I said bitterly. Yet now they're calling the shots. Keith reached out, putting a hand on my shoulder. They care about Ben, too, in their own way. I shrugged off his hand and stood up. I'm not sure this is about caring. It feels like control. He sighed deeply. We can't control everything, Loretta. Sometimes we have to let go. I turned to face him, my hands on my hips. Let go? Of Ben? After all we've done for him? Keith stood up, putting a steadying hand on my arm. Loretta, fighting this won't bring Ben back. It'll just push him further away. I looked around at the scattered boxes, the remnants of a childhood I had helped nurture. Maybe letting go isn't the answer. Maybe it's time to fight for what's ours. Keith shook his head sadly. I just want peace, Loretta, for all of us. I met his gaze, my resolve hardening. Peace won't come from giving in. If Kara's family thinks they can just take Ben away, they've got another thing coming. Keith's eyes searched mine, trying to find a middle ground. But I saw what they were really after. They wanted compliance, not peace. I turned back to the boxes, pulling out another childhood memory. I'm not going to lose him without a fight. The high-end restaurant buzzed with low chatter and clinking glasses. I slipped in quietly, hoping no one would notice me. Keith and Ben had insisted on meeting Kara's parents alone, but I had a gut feeling something was off. I found a corner seat with a good view of their table, and settled in, keeping my eyes on them. Keith was turned slightly away from me, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. Ben sat next to him, stiff and formal. Across from them sat Mr. and Mrs. Myers, looking every bit the picture of conservative respectability. I strained to hear as Keith began speaking. Yes, raising Ben alone was the hardest thing I've ever done. Mrs. Myers nodded sympathetically, her voice soft but firm. A valiant effort, considering the circumstances. I felt my blood run cold. What circumstances were they talking about? Keith had never raised Ben alone. I had been there every step of the way. Keith, Mr. Myers said, his tone measured, losing Ben's mother must have been a devastating blow. Keith glanced at Ben before responding, his voice wavering. Yes, it was. Janet's death was something we struggled with for a long time. My heart pounded in my chest. Janet wasn't dead. Why were they lying about this? I leaned in closer, trying to make sense of it all. Mrs. Myers continued, her expression stern. And now you've remarried. It's important for us to understand the family dynamic. We have expectations for Kara and Ben's future, you see. Ben spoke up, his voice placating. We understand, Mrs. Myers. We want the same things. Keith jumped in, eager to please. We've done our best to provide a stable and loving environment for Ben. Mr. Myers narrowed his eyes. And Loretta? How does she fit into all this? Keith hesitated. Loretta has been supportive, but it's been challenging. I felt a knot of anger twist in my stomach. Challenging? I had done nothing but support them both. Mrs. Myers nodded. We expect full commitment to our values and traditions. Any deviation can be problematic. Ben nodded quickly. We'll make sure everything aligns with your expectations. Keith seemed to relax a bit, comforted by Ben's agreement. Yes, we'll do whatever it takes to ensure a smooth transition. I couldn't hold back any longer. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. The entire table turned to look at me. Loretta? Keith's face went pale. Whatever it takes, huh? I said, my voice steady but loud enough for the whole table to hear. Lies about Ben's mother? Excluding me from this meeting? Is that how you plan to make things smooth? Mr. and Mrs. Myers looked shocked, but it was Mrs. Myers who recovered first. This is a private family matter, Mrs. Faulkner, I finished for her. Loretta Faulkner. And believe me, I am very much part of this family. Ben looked stricken, but didn't say a word. Keith stood up, trying to calm things down. Loretta, this isn't the time or place. No, Keith, I snapped. This is the perfect time. Enough with the secrets and lies. Tell them the truth about Janet. Keith's shoulders slumped, and he looked at Mr. and Mrs. Myers, then back at me. I can explain. Explain all you want, I said, my voice boiling with anger. But it won't change the fact that this whole thing is built on lies. I turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving them all in stunned silence. Outside, the night air was crisp, and I took a deep breath, trying to calm down. This was just the beginning. If they wanted a fight, I was more than ready to give it to them. I barely made it to the parking lot before my phone started buzzing. It was Keith. I ignored it, pacing between the cars, my mind racing. The cool night air did little to calm me down. I heard the restaurant door burst open, and there was Keith, with Ben and Kara trailing behind him. Loretta, wait! I stopped and turned to face them, arms crossed. Keith approached cautiously. We need to talk about this. Talk? I said, my voice dripping with anger. You mean explain why you've been lying to everyone? Ben stepped forward, looking desperate. Loretta, please. We can work this out. Work this out? I scoffed. How are we supposed to work out lies? Kara's expression hardened as she stepped up next to Ben. Maybe it's best for everyone if we just separate for a while. I glared at her. Separate? So you can play happy families with your version of the truth? Keith intervened, his tone pleading. Loretta, please, this isn't the time or place for this. Just then, the door of the restaurant swung open again, and a familiar figure appeared. Janet. Her presence was a shockwave. Everyone went silent, eyes widening in disbelief. Well, Janet said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. If it isn't the hero dad and his loyal son. Kara frowned, confused. Who is this? Oh, just the ghost of Keith's past, Janet replied sardonically, sidling up to Keith. Isn't that right, dear? Keith stepped back, his face pale. Janet, what are you doing here? Just thought I'd drop by and see my lovely family, Janet said, putting an arm around Ben, who looked mortified. Seems like you've been having quite the heart-to-heart. Well, Kara looked at Ben, then at Keith, then at me. What is going on here? Who is she? Janet released Ben and turned to face Kara. I'm Ben's mother, his very alive and kicking mother. Surprised? Kara's face turned a shade paler, and she looked at Keith accusingly. You said she was dead. Keith opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Janet laughed, a cold, harsh sound that seemed to echo in the still night air. Dead? Oh no, very much alive, thank you. Why would you lie about something like that? Kara shouted at Ben and Keith, her voice filled with betrayal. Ben stammered, unable to meet her eyes. Kara, it's not what you think. We didn't want your parents to judge us. Janet laughed again, more bitterly this time. Judgment? Honey, if you think lying is better than facing judgment, then you don't know anything about family. Kara's eyes filled with tears. I can't believe you lied to me. Keith tried to put a hand on her shoulder, but she pushed him away. Just stay away from me, she said, her voice trembling. She turned and ran to her car, leaving us standing there in the parking lot. Ben looked torn, but he turned to follow Kara. Kara, wait. Janet grabbed his arm, stopping him. Let her go, Ben. Sometimes people need to face the truth. Keith was at a loss, looking between Janet and me. Loretta, Save it, I said, cutting him off. This can't be happening. Janet gave me a knowing look. Oh, it's happening, all right, and it's about time. Keith stood there in silence, knowing the facade he'd built was crumbling before his eyes. The wreckage lay before us, and there was no going back. The smell of fresh coffee filled my sister's kitchen as I sat at the small wooden table, staring blankly ahead. My sister, Marie, bustled around, trying to make me feel at home. Janet was supposed to arrive any minute, and the tension in the air was palpable. Marie set down 2 steaming mugs and sat across from me. You're handling this better than I would, she said softly. Before I could respond, the doorbell rang. Marie rose to answer it, and moments later, Janet walked in. She looked around briefly before fixing her gaze on me. Loretta, she greeted, her voice firm but not unkind. Janet, I replied, motioning for her to take a seat. Marie took the hint and left us alone, slipping out the back door to give us privacy. Janet sat down and wrapped her hands around the coffee mug, staring intently at the dark liquid. So, that was quite the scene at the restaurant. I nodded, taking a sip of my coffee. You certainly know how to make an entrance. Janet smirked, but her eyes lacked humor. It needed to be done. Keith and Ben have fooled everyone long enough. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on us. Finally, Janet spoke, her voice more gentle. Loretta, I'm sorry you got caught up in this mess. I appreciate that, Janet. But it's not just me, it's everyone. Kara, her family, even Ben. Janet's eyes darkened. Especially Ben. He needs to know his actions have consequences. I set down my mug, leaning forward. It's time they face the consequences. Janet's gaze was unwavering. I'll help you make sure of it. The determination in her voice bolstered my own resolve. We weren't just 2 women wronged. We were 2 forces ready to set things right. So, what's the plan? Janet asked, her tone businesslike. We need to expose the lies, I said firmly. Keith's made a mess, and it's time he cleaned it up, Janet nodded. That means telling Kara's family the full truth. Not just about me, but everything. The gambling, the debts, all of it. I smiled slightly. Sounds like you have some history to share. Janet stirred her coffee absent-mindedly. You have no idea. Keith's gambling was the final straw for me. When I left, I thought that chapter was closed, but it sounds like it's come back to haunt him. I glanced out the window, my mind racing with possibilities. We need to gather evidence, something concrete to show Kara's family who Keith really is, Janet agreed. I have some old records, bank statements, loan agreements. It should be enough to start with. As we mapped out our plan, I felt a weight lifting. There was a clarity to having a purpose, a direction. For too long, I had been reacting to the chaos. Now I was taking control. Marie peeked through the door, hesitant. Do you need anything else? I shook my head, smiling at my sister. We're good for now, thanks. Marie nodded and retreated, leaving Janet and me to finalize our strategy. The coffee grew cold as we talked, but neither of us noticed. We were driven by more potent fuel, justice and the promise of setting things right. By the time Janet left, I felt a renewed sense of resolve. We had a plan, and I had an ally. The facade Keith had carefully constructed was about to crumble, and I was ready to reveal the truth. No more lies, no more deception. They were going to learn that actions have consequences. And this time, I wouldn't back down. The high-rise office building loomed above me as I stepped into the lobby. Keith's office was on the 15th floor, and the elevator ride up gave me enough time to calm my nerves. I needed to stay composed. The doors slid open with a soft ping, and I walked out, scanning for his office. Getting past the receptionist was easier than I expected. A firm, "I'm here to see Keith Faulkner," and a no-nonsense attitude did the trick. Keith's door was partially open. I knocked briefly before pushing it open. He looked up, startled, papers strewn across his desk. "Loretta, what are you doing here?" His voice was strained, a mix of surprise and irritation. I closed the door behind me, striding to his desk. "We need to talk, Keith. Now." He leaned back, trying to mask his unease. "Can't this wait until I get home?" "No, it can't." I placed a stack of papers on his desk. "These are from Janet, bank statements, loan agreements, all from your gambling days." Keith's face turned ashen as he flipped through the documents. "Why are you bringing this up now?" "Because it's time the world knows who you really are," I said, my voice steady and unyielding. He stood up, slamming the papers down. "You wouldn't dare. Do you have any idea what this could do to me?" "I know exactly what it will do," I replied coldly, "and that's precisely the point." Keith's eyes narrowed, a look of disdain crossing his face. "You think you're so righteous, don't you? Coming here, threatening me with my past." "This isn't about righteousness, Keith. This is about justice. For me, for Ben, for everyone you've deceived." He took a step closer, his voice low and menacing. "You're playing a dangerous game, Loretta. You won't win." I matched his gaze, unwavering. "I'm not here to win, Keith. I'm here to expose the truth." The room fell silent, the tension thick. Keith finally broke the stare, sinking back into his chair. "What do you want?" "I want you to come clean, to Ben, to Kara, to her family. Tell them everything, why you lied, the gambling, the debts." He shook his head. "You realize this could ruin everything, right? My job, my reputation." "Your job and reputation are nothing compared to the damage you've already done," I shot back. "And if you don't come clean, I will." Keith's hands clenched the edge of his desk, knuckles white. "And what about Ben? Have you thought about what this will do to him?" "I've thought about nothing else," I replied. "This is the only way to break the cycle of lies. It's time he knows the truth." Keith slumped in his chair, defeated. "Fine, I'll do it. Today," I insisted. "No more delays, no more excuses." He looked up at me, a mixture of resentment and resignation in his eyes. "Today." I turned to leave, pausing at the door. "And Keith, if you ever try to pull something like this again, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly who you are." Without waiting for a response, I walked out, the weight of the confrontation lingering in the air. The elevator ride down was a blur, my mind racing with the implications of what I had just set in motion. As soon as I stepped out into the sunlight, I felt a sense of resolve harden within me. This was far from over, but we were one step closer to the truth. One step closer to justice for all the lies and betrayal. The facade was crumbling, and Keith was painfully aware of it. And this time, I wouldn't back down. My bustling handmade furniture shop was a far cry from the turmoil that had consumed the past few months. Wood shavings littered the floor, sawdust hung lightly in the air, and the aroma of freshly cut timber was soothing. This place had become my sanctuary, a haven from the chaos Keith had sown. My phone buzzed on the workbench, pulling me from my thoughts. It was a message from Janet. "It's done." He told them everything. A mix of relief and apprehension settled in my chest. I had pushed for this, but now that the truth was out, the real consequences had begun to unfold. The bell above the shop door jingled, and I looked up to see Janet walking in. She seemed lighter, as if a burden had been lifted from her shoulders. "Well?" I asked, setting down my tools. "He did it," Janet confirmed. "Keith came clean to Kara's family. It was a mess, to put it mildly." I shook my head. "That's an understatement." Janet pulled up a stool and sat down. "Kara's parents were furious. They had no idea they were being lied to, and they're pulling their support for the wedding." "What about Ben?" I asked, dreading the answer. "He's devastated," Janet said softly, "but he needed to hear the truth. It was time." I nodded, knowing she was right. Ben had been caught in the middle of a web of lies, and now he was facing the fallout. "And Keith?" Janet sighed. "He's lost everything. His job, his reputation, Ben. It's all crumbled." A part of me felt pity for Keith, but another part, The part that had been hurt and betrayed felt justified. Sometimes the hardest battles bring the greatest rewards. Janet gave me a small smile, and sometimes they bring clarity. Ben knows now who his father really is, and he knows who stood by him through it all. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the past months settling between us. Finally, Janet spoke again. So, what now? I looked around my workshop, taking in the fruits of my labor. Now we move forward. I'm expanding the shop, taking on more clients. This place is thriving, and it's only going to get better. Janet nodded, a look of admiration in her eyes. You've built something incredible here, Loretta. And so can you, I said, meeting her gaze. We're stronger than we give ourselves credit for. Just then the doorbell jingled again. This time it was Ben. He looked worn out, shadows under his eyes, but there was a determination there too. Mom, he said, addressing both Janet and me. Can we talk? We nodded, and he joined us, pulling up a stool next to Janet. I'm sorry, he began, his voice choked. For everything. I didn't want to see the truth. Janet put an arm around him. It's okay, Ben. The important thing is you see it now. Ben looked at me, his eyes filled with regret. Loretta, I shouldn't have left like that. I didn't understand how much you cared. I reached out and took his hand. What matters now is that you're here. We can rebuild together. As we sat there, the three of us, an unexpected feeling of hope blossomed. The past had been painful, but it had also revealed strength and resilience. And now, finally, we could move forward. Janet stood up, a smile on her face. Let's go celebrate. Dinner on me. We all laughed, the first genuine laughter in what felt like ages. We left the workshop, stepping out into the sunlight, ready to face whatever came next, together.